The laughter in the hall, the afternoon sun fell through the tall glass windows of the school auditorium, turning the polished wooden floor into a golden sheet. Inside, rows of cushioned chairs faced a wide stage where students gathered for a rehearsal. The place smelled faintly of fresh paint and paper programs. At the front row sat a girl in a bright designer jacket, her hair perfectly styled, a silver bracelet catching the light every time she moved her hand. She leaned toward her, friends speaking in a voice just loud enough for others nearby to hear. They giggled at something, covering their mouths as if to hide the sound, but not really hiding it at all. Near the back of the hall, a young woman stepped in quietly. She carried a paper bag in her hands, clutching it close to her chest. Shoes were worn at the heels, and her plain sweater looked like it had been washed many times. She moved carefully, trying not to draw attention, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found the boy sitting near the aisle. He looked up, his face lighting with a smile, and she walked toward him. She handed him the bag, his lunch, and whispered something that made him nod. She didn't plan to stay long. This place wasn't hers. She was here only to make sure her younger brother had something to eat before the long practice. But before she could turn away, she felt eyes on her. She looked up and saw the rich girl in the front row, leaning back in her seat, one eyebrow raised. The girl's lips curved into a smile that wasn't warm at all. She whispered something to the girl next to her, and a moment later, the sound. A soft laughter floated across the room. It was a kind of laugh that didn't come from humor. It came from pride, from looking down on someone. The young woman didn't need to hear the words to know what was being said. She saw the quick glances at her sweater, the smirks when their eyes met. Her brother's smile faded. He shifted uncomfortably, as if he wished she would leave quickly. She pretended not to notice and gave his shoulder a light pat before stepping away. But inside, something tightened in her chest. The rich girl turned back toward the stage, still smiling to her friends, as if the small moment had already been forgotten. But for the young woman walking toward the exit, it wasn't so small. She had been laughed at before. It happened in the grocery store when she paid in coins. It happened in the street when people saw her walking home from work in a uniform. It happened enough times that she had learned to keep her head down and keep moving. But this was different. This was her brother's school, a place where she had hoped he would be safe from that kind of cruelty. As she reached the door, she glanced back once. The girl in the bright jacket was still in the front row, still at the center of attention, still looking like someone who had never had to think about the price of bread or the weight of overdue bills. For a moment, the young woman's thoughts drifted to another life, the one she had imagined when she was her brother's age. She had dreamed of being the one on a stage, not in a chair, not in a uniform, not carrying paper bags. She had dreamed of singing under the lights, her voice filling a room like this. But life had other plans. Work came first. Bills came first. She turned away, telling herself it didn't matter, that a laugh was just a sound and nothing more. But deep down, she knew it wasn't the sound that stayed with her. It was the way the rich girl had looked at her, as if she was nothing. Walking home, the sound of that laugh followed her. It seemed to echo off the pavement, mixing with the hum of passing cars. She tried to push it away, focusing instead on the thought of her grandmother waiting at home, on the smell of soup that would be cooking by now. Still, a quiet thought whispered in the back of her mind. One day, she would like to see that kind of laughter stop, not because she shouted, not because she fought back, but because she had shown something the rich girl could never take away. When she reached home, her grandmother noticed the look on her face. "Long day?" she asked softly. The young woman hesitated, then gave a small smile. "Just one of those days." She didn't explain. She didn't need to. Her grandmother had seen enough of life to know what those words meant. Later, as the evening settled, and the sky outside turned deep blue, the young woman sat by the small wooden table in the corner of their kitchen. She took out an old notebook, its cover worn and corners bent. Inside were pages filled with words, her words and melodies only she knew. She hadn't touched it in months, maybe longer. She ran her fingers over the paper and felt something stir inside her, something she thought she had buried under work and routine. It was the same feeling she had when she was a child, singing softly while washing dishes, or humming in the dark when the lights went out. The laughter in the hall still echoed in her ears, but now it didn't feel as heavy. It felt like the start of something. She didn't know how or when, but she knew this. One day she would sing again, and when she did, her voice would be louder than any laugh. Life behind the gates to the rich part of town, were not just metal and paint. They were invisible lines that divided two worlds. On one side, the air smelled faintly of flowers from well-kept gardens, and the streets were quiet except for the soft hum of expensive cars. On the other side, the sidewalks were cracked, children played in narrow alleys, and the smell of cooking drifted from open windows. The young woman lived on that other side. Her home was a tour-room apartment on the top floor of an old brick building. The walls had faded paint, the wooden floor creaked in certain spots, and the windows let in a draft in winter. But inside, it was clean, and every corner spoke of care. A potted plant on the windowsill, a neatly folded blanket on the couch, and photographs taped to the wall. She shared the space with her younger brother and their grandmother. Her brother's school uniform hung on a hook near the door, brushed and ready for the next day. Their grandmother's chair sat near the small heater, a basket of knitting on the floor beside it. This was their safe place, even if the world outside wasn't. Always kind. Most mornings began before the sun was up. The young woman would prepare breakfast, porridge in winter, bread and tea in summer, then pack her brother's lunch. After he left for school, she put on her work uniform and walked down to the bus stop. The ride took her past the gates, into the part of town where houses stood like palaces, each with wide lawns and polished driveways. She worked as a cleaner in one of those houses. The kitchen alone was bigger than her whole apartment. Everything shone: the marble counters, the silver taps, the spotless glass cabinets. The family barely noticed her presence, except to give instructions or leave a list on the counter. She didn't mind. She wasn't there for conversation. She was there because the job paid enough to keep the lights on and food on the table. Her days were long, scrubbing floors, polishing furniture, folding laundry so it looked untouched. By the time she returned home, her back ached and her hands were dry from soap. But the moment her brother came running to the door, waving his school papers and telling her about his day, she forgot her tiredness for a little while. Music had once been a part of her life. Her late mother used to sing while cooking, her voice warm and rich. As a child, the young woman would join in, making up words when she didn't know the real ones. At school, she had been part of the choir. Teachers had praised her voice, telling her she could go far if she kept training. But dreams needed time and money, and she had neither. After her mother passed away, she had to step in to help her grandmother raise her brother. Music was set aside, stored in that old notebook she kept hidden away. Her brother, however, never stopped believing in her voice. Sometimes, late at night, when they were both awake, he would whisper, "Sing for me," and she would quietly so the neighbors wouldn't hear, filling the dark room with soft notes that made him fall asleep with a smile. The day after the laughter in the school hall, she walked past the gates as usual, but something felt different. She couldn't shake the memory of the rich girl's smirk, the way her friends had leaned in to whisper. The gates had always been there, but now she felt them more sharply, not just as a line between two streets, but as a wall between people. At the house where she worked, she caught sight of the family's daughter, the same rich girl from the hall, walking through the living room, phone in hand, laughing at something on the screen. She didn't notice the young woman at all. The cleaner kept her eyes down, dusting the shelf until the girl disappeared upstairs. That evening, her brother told her about the charity talent show. "It's for raising money for the children's hospital," he explained. "It's open to everyone. You could sing?" She laughed softly, shaking her head. "That's not for me." But he didn't give up. "Why not? You're better than anyone at school. You're better than anyone I've heard." His voice was so full of certainty that it caught her off guard. She wanted to tell him all the reasons why it was impossible: her work schedule, her lack of proper clothes, the fact that people would stare at her the way the rich girl had stared. But instead, she just said, "We'll see." That night, as she washed the dinner dishes, she caught herself humming a melody she hadn't thought about in years. It was from one of her own songs, one she had written back when the future still seemed wide open. The sound lingered in the small kitchen. Wrapping around her like a memory, she dried her hands and went to the cupboard where her old notebook was tucked away. She ran her fingers over the cover, then slowly opened it. The pages were filled with her handwriting, each song a piece of her life, moments of joy, loss, hope, and love. She read the words to one of them, and her throat tightened, for the first time in years. She let herself think about what it would feel like to stand under the lights, not as someone's maid, but as herself, with her voice carrying across the room, her song telling a story only she could tell. The gate still stood between her and that stage. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way through. The unexpected competition, the week rolled on with the same rhythm. Early mornings, bus rides, work, and home again. The young woman thought little about the laughter in the hall, except when it slipped into her mind during quiet moments. Didn't want to give it power, yet it lingered like the faint echo of a bell long after it had been struck. It was a Thursday afternoon when her brother came home earlier than usual, his eyes bright with excitement. He dropped his school bag on the chair and announced, "They put up the list today. You won't believe it." She was peeling potatoes at the kitchen counter and glanced at him with a small smile. "What list? The one for the charity talent show?" "It's all over school. They're calling it Voices for Hope. There's singing, dancing, even a poetry act. And guess what? It's not just for students. Anyone connected to the school can join. That means you can." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "That's for performers, not cleaners." He crossed his arms. "You're not just a cleaner. You can sing better than anyone I know. You could win." She set down the knife and turned to face him. "It's not about winning. And besides, I don't have time for things like that." But her brother wasn't convinced. "You do have time. The practices are in the evenings, and it's only for a few weeks. I'll help you with everything here. Please, just think about it." That night over dinner, he brought it up again. And again when she was folding laundry. By the time she went to bed, she was tired of saying no. But the truth was, she hadn't fully closed the door in her mind. The next day, while working in the rich family's kitchen, she overheard their daughter, the same girl who had laughed at her, talking to her friends on speakerphone. "I'm doing this show, obviously," the girl said. "We're going to do that big hit from last summer. We'll have the outfits, the lights, everything. It's going to be hilarious to see who else tries."
Oh, some people just don't.
"Belong on a stage." Her friends laughed through the phone, their voices echoing in the spacious room. The young woman kept her back to them, wiping down the counters slowly, but every word sank in. When she got home, she found her brother waiting for her with a pen in hand and the talent show sign-up form, already filled out except for her signature. "It's due tomorrow," he said quietly. "If you don't sign, it's fine. But I think you should." She took the form and sat down. For a moment, the pen hovered over the paper. The laughter in the hall, the smirk in the kitchen, her brother's hopeful eyes, they all collided in her mind. She signed. The first practice was held in the small music room at the back of the school. Folding chairs lined the walls, and an old piano sat in the corner. The room buzzed with voices and nervous laughter. When she walked in, heads turned. Some of the students whispered to each other, clearly surprised to see her there. She felt her face warm, but she kept walking, choosing a chair near the back. The organizer, kind-faced teacher, welcomed everyone and began going through the list of acts. When the rich girl's name was called, she stood proudly, outlining her plan in a confident voice. Her friends nodded along, already certain of their performance. When the young woman's name came up, the teacher smiled encouragingly. "And what will you be performing?" She hesitated for only a moment. "I'll be singing an original song." There was a brief pause in the room. Some students looked at each other. One raised an eyebrow, as if surprised she had anything original to sing. The rich girl smirked but said nothing. Practice began. One by one, people took turns showing a bit of what they would do. The young woman waited, her hands folded in her lap. When it was finally her turn, she stepped to the front. Holding her father's old guitar, she strummed a few notes, soft, uncertain at first. The room quieted. She began to sing, not loudly, but with a voice that carried warmth, the kind that pulled people in instead of pushing them back. The song was unfinished, just a piece she had written years ago, but the words spoke of working hands, of tired feet, and of dreams that refused to die. When she stopped, the silence in the room lingered. For a moment before the teacher clapped. "Beautiful," she said warmly. "I think we're all looking forward to hearing the full song." The young woman gave a small smile and stepped back to her seat. She didn't look toward the rich girl, but she felt the eyes on her. That night, she walked home under the streetlights, her guitar slung over her shoulder. The streets were quiet, and the cool air wrapped around her like a blanket. She thought about how it felt to sing in that room, how the words had flowed out like they had been waiting for this moment all along. It wasn't about proving anything to the rich girl anymore. It was about proving something to herself. That the part of her she thought was gone was still there, live and strong. And somewhere deep inside, she began to believe that, maybe, just maybe, the final word in this story wouldn't be laughter. It would be a song, the song choice of the week. After the first practice felt different. Work was the same, the smell of cleaning products, the sound of vacuuming, quiet clink of dishes being stacked away, but her mind kept drifting to the music room. Every time she thought about the show, a nervous flutter stirred in her chest. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something more complicated, part excitement, part doubt, part something she couldn't yet name. One evening, after washing the dinner dishes, she took out her old notebook and sat at the kitchen table. The pages were yellowed at the edges, but the ink still carried her handwriting, uneven but alive. Each one like a snapshot from another time. Some were light and playful, full of laughter and sunny afternoons. Others were heavy with longing, born from late nights when sleep wouldn't come. But one stood out, the one she had written the week after her mother passed away. It was raw, filled with lines about carrying weight too soon, about hands that worked until they ached, about finding beauty in small moments, a patch of sunlight on the floor, a warm cup of tea, the sound of someone's voice in the next room. She read through the verses slowly. The words weren't polished. They weren't the kind of lyrics you'd hear on the radio, but they were hers, and they told her truth. Her brother, sitting on the couch nearby, looked up from his homework. "Is that the one you used to sing? To me? When I couldn't sleep?" She nodded. "Yes, I wrote it for us, I suppose." He grinned. "And that's the one you should sing." She hesitated. "It's not flashy, it's not big, but it's real," he said firmly. "And people will feel it. You don't need big lights or fancy clothes. You just need to sing like you always do when it's just us." The next evening, after work, she stopped by a small music shop on her walk home. Inside, the air smelled of wood and strings. She bought a fresh set of guitar strings, the shopkeeper nodding when she mentioned she had a performance coming up that night. She sat on the edge of her bed and carefully replaced the old strings on her father's guitar. The wood was scratched and worn, but when she ran her fingers over it, it felt steady, familiar, like it had been waiting for her all this time. She practiced quietly, shaping the song into something whole. At first, her voice wavered, but the more she sang, the stronger it grew. Each note felt like a step forward, each word like a piece of herself she was reclaiming. By the end of the week, the song had taken on a new life. She added a small instrumental break in the middle, letting the guitar speak where words could not. She polished the final verse, making sure it ended not in sadness, but in quiet hope, the kind that lingers at the second practice. The room was more crowded than before. Some performers had brought props, costumes, even small lights. The rich girl arrived in a glittering jacket, her hair perfect, her friends carrying garment bags. They spoke loudly, filling the air with their voices. When it was the young woman's turn, she walked to the front, guitar in hand. She didn't have a costume or backup dancers, only the song and the steady beat of her heart. She began softly, her fingers moving over the strings, her voice carrying through the room. This time, she didn't just sing the notes, she told the story. She sang of early mornings when the sky was still dark, of carrying groceries up long flights of stairs, of laughter that was rare but precious. She sang of holding on, even when the world seemed to press down. By the time she reached the final verse, the room had gone completely still. Even the rich girl, leaning casually in her chair, had straightened up, her expression unreadable. When the last note faded, the teacher clapped first, then others joined in, not the loud, showy kind of applause, but the kind that came from genuine respect. The young woman gave a small nod and returned to her seat. She didn't need to look around to know she had been heard. Walking home that night, she felt lighter. The song wasn't just something she would perform, it was a piece of her life she was finally willing to share. Her brother was waiting at the window when she arrived, waving as she climbed the stairs. "So, how did it go?" he asked eagerly. She smiled, setting the guitar down gently. "It went better than I expected." He leaned against the table. "Then it's settled. That's your song. No changes, no second guesses." She laughed softly. "All right, it's no changes." But deep inside, she knew something had already changed. Not in the song, but in her. She had stopped thinking about whether she belonged on that stage. Now she was thinking about what it would feel like when she stepped onto it for real. With the lights above her and the whole room listening, and for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of being seen. The day of the show, the morning of the talent show, began with the soft patter of rain against the window. The young woman woke before her alarm, the sound of the drops steady and calm. Like a gentle drumbeat in the distance, she lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the day ahead settle in her chest. It wasn't just a performance. It was the first time in years she would stand before a crowd, not as someone's maid, not as a background face, but as herself. Her brother was already up, moving around the kitchen in his socks. The smell of toast drifted through the apartment. When she walked in, he grinned. "Big day," he said, sliding a mug of tea toward her.
Eat something.
"You'll need the energy." She smiled and sat down, though her stomach felt tight. She had barely slept, running through the song over and over in her head, imagining the faces in the crowd. She told herself it didn't matter who clapped or who didn't. The real goal was just to sing. But deep down, she knew it mattered more than she wanted to admit. After breakfast, she took out the dress she had chosen, a simple, soft-colored one her grandmother had sewn years ago for a family wedding. It wasn't new or fancy, but it was clean, fitted well, and made her feel steady. She tied her hair back loosely and put on the smallest bit of makeup, just enough to keep the stage lights from washing her out. The guitar case felt heavier than usual as she carried it down the stairs and into the cool, damp air. Her brother walked beside her, holding an umbrella over them both as they made their way to the bus stop. By the time they arrived at the school auditorium, the rain had stopped, replaced by the hum of voices and the clatter of last-minute preparations. Backstage, performers were already buzzing with energy, stretching, rehearsing, adjusting costumes. She found a quiet corner and set down her guitar. The rich girl was there too, her glittering outfit catching the light, her friends swarming around her like a small entourage. They laughed and posed for photos, the air around them bright with confidence. The young woman didn't join in. She tuned her guitar slowly, letting the sound of each string settle her nerves. She ran through the opening chords in her mind, reminding herself of the words she had lived, not just written. A stagehand came by, handing out programs. She glanced at the list. She was near the end of the show, just before the final group act. That meant she would have to sit through nearly the entire performance before her turn came. The audience began to fill the hall. Parents, students, teachers, and neighbors from the community took their seats. The air was thick with chatter and the occasional burst of laughter. Somewhere in the middle row, she spotted her grandmother sitting straight-backed, hands folded over her bag, a small, proud smile on her face. Her brother sat beside her, waving both arms until she waved back. That small exchange made her heart steady. The show began with a dance troupe, sharp movements, bright lights, applause. Then came a pair of violinists, a comedian, and a small choir. The rich girl's act was in the middle, and when her turn came, the room seemed to lean forward. She and her friends performed with energy, loud, flashy, full of movement. The crowd cheered, clapping along to the beat. When they finished, the applause was strong, but the rich girl glanced toward the back of the stage, her eyes briefly meeting the young woman's before she turned away. Finally, it was her turn. The stagehand whispered, "You're next," and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to the space between her and the microphone. She walked out slowly, her guitar in hand, the lights bright and warm on her face. The hall looked different from up here. The rows of people were a blur. But she could still make out her grandmother in the distance, her brother leaning forward. With both hands gripping the edge of his seat, she took a breath, adjusted the strap of her guitar, and let her fingers find the first chord. The sound rang out, soft but clear, cutting through the quiet. Her voice followed low, steady, each word a step deeper into the song. She sang of long days and quiet nights, of holding on when there was little to hold on to, of finding beauty in moments most people overlooked. Her eyes stayed mostly on her guitar, but sometimes she glanced up, catching the stillness in the room. By the second verse, she felt the shift, the audience leaning in, the murmurs gone. The song wasn't loud, but it carried every note settling into the air like it belonged there. When she reached the last chorus, her voice lifted, not in volume, but in something richer, a kind of strength she hadn't known she still had. The final chord faded, leaving the room in silence for a heartbeat. Then the applause began. First a few claps, then more, growing until it filled the hall. She gave a small bow, her lips curved into a quiet smile, and walked off the stage, without looking toward the rich girl. Backstage, she set her guitar down and exhaled. She had done it, not for the trophy, not for the approval, but because the song had been waiting to be sung. Her brother met her the moment she stepped into the hall, eyes shining. "You were amazing," he said, gripping her arm. Her grandmother, slower but just as warm, took her hand and squeezed it. The rich girl passed by a few minutes later, her face unreadable. She didn't speak, but she didn't smirk either. For the young woman, that was enough. The voice that silenced the room, the applause from her performance, echoed in her mind long after she had left the stage. She could still feel the warmth of the lights on her skin, the weight of the guitar strap on her shoulder, and the quiet that had hung in the air during her final note. It wasn't the loudness of the applause that stayed with her, it was the silence before it. That deep, still moment when it felt like every person in the room was holding their breath. Caught inside the world her song had built, she sat backstage on a folding chair, hands resting on the worn wood of her guitar. Other performers came and went, buzzing with post-performance energy, but she stayed quiet, letting the sound of her song replay in her memory. In the audience, the effect of her performance lingered. Parents who had been scrolling through their phones earlier now sat talking softly to each other. A teacher near the back wiped at her eyes. Even the younger students, who had been restless during some of the earlier acts, stayed unusually still. Her brother couldn't stop smiling. He leaned toward their grandmother and whispered something that made her nod slowly. Her lips pressed into a proud, thin smile. The rich girl sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't clapped the loudest, but she hadn't looked away either. There was no smirk on her face now, only a quiet, unreadable expression. When the final act ended and the show came to a close, people began to filter out of the hall. The young woman stayed backstage, packing her guitar carefully into its case. She didn't want to get caught in the crowd. She wasn't used to that much attention. But before she could leave, the music teacher came up to her, a warm smile on her face. "That was beautiful," she said. "You have a gift, and it's not just your voice, it's how you use it. You made the whole room listen." The young woman felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you," she said softly, as she stepped into the hallway. A few strangers stopped her, parents she didn't know, a student she'd never spoken to, each saying some version of, "That was amazing," or "You made me feel something." She thanked them quietly, unsure of what else to say. Outside, cool night air wrapped around her, the faint smell of rain still lingering from the morning. Her brother ran ahead a few steps, then turned back. "You saw them, right?" Everyone was quiet. Even she was quiet. The young woman asked, though she knew who he meant. The rich girl, he said, lowering his voice like it was a secret. She didn't laugh. She didn't even look like she wanted to. The young woman smiled faintly, but said nothing. She wasn't looking for the rich girl's approval, but something about knowing her song had reached even her, that it had. Slipped past whatever walls she kept up, felt like its own quiet victory. The next morning, her phone buzzed with a message from one of the students who had been in the audience. It was a link to a video shaky and recorded from the middle rows, but still clear enough to hear her voice. The caption read, "The maid who sang the whole room silent." She hesitated before pressing play. Watching herself was strange, seeing the way she had kept her eyes mostly on the guitar, how her fingers moved on the strings, how the sound seemed softer and stronger at the same time. She noticed the stillness in the crowd, the way heads tilted forward to listen. By midday, the video had been shared dozens of times among students and parents. Comments appeared beneath it. "She should sing professionally. That song made me cry. Real talent." She didn't know what to do with the attention. She still had laundry to do, groceries to buy, and a shift at the house behind the gates. Life didn't pause just because people had clapped for her. But every time she thought about that moment on stage, something in her posture shifted just slightly straighter, just slightly lighter. When she arrived at work that afternoon, the rich girl's mother greeted her at the door. "I saw the video," she said. "You have an incredible voice." The young woman thanked her quietly and went about her work, moving through the kitchen, dusting the shelves, polishing the silver. She didn't expect to see the rich girl, but halfway through her shift, she appeared in the doorway. They stood there for a moment, the air between them awkward but not hostile. Finally, the rich girl said, "You were good, really good." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was something. The young woman only nodded and said, "Thank you," before returning to her work. That evening at home, her brother replayed the video again and again, singing along to the chorus. "You know this isn't the end, right?" he said between plays. "You can't just stop here," she smiled, shaking her head, one step at a time. But deep down, she knew he was right. Something had begun the moment she stepped on that stage, something she didn't want to end. And though the rich girl's words were simple, the truth was already clear. Laughter had started this story, but the silence, that deep, unbroken silence before the applause, belonged entirely to the song. The final word the week after the show felt different, though life on the surface went on as usual. The buses still rattled along the same cracked streets. The laundry still needed folding, and the kitchen at work still had its endless counters to polish, but something subtle had shifted. Where before she could walk through the school unnoticed, now heads turned. Some students nodded politely, others smiled. A few even stopped her to say they had watched her video online. Her brother grinned every time it happened. "See," he'd whisper afterward, "they know who you are now." She never sought fame, but she could feel it, the quiet change. In how people looked at her, not with pity, not with judgment, but with recognition. One Thursday morning, she was at work dusting the large bookshelf in the living room when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see the rich girl standing there, not with her usual confident pose, but hesitating, one hand gripping the strap of her bag. The rich girl cleared her throat. "I was going to say this earlier, but I didn't know how." She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "I was wrong about you, about everything, I guess." The young woman didn't reply right away. She simply stood, holding the cloth in her hands, waiting. "I used to think," the rich girl's voice wavered slightly, "don't know, that people like you didn't belong in certain places. But when you sang," she shook her head, "you made everyone listen. I couldn't stop listening." It wasn't a dramatic apology, but it was genuine. And for the first time, the young woman saw not the smirk, not the shield of confidence, but something softer, a person learning to see differently. She gave a small nod. "Thank you for saying that." The rich girl shifted awkwardly then, said, "If you ever wanted help with getting more people to hear your music, I know some people." "I could." The young woman smiled faintly. "Maybe someday." That evening, she walked home with her brother, the late sun painting the streets in warm gold. He was talking about his day, about a math test, about a game he'd played with friends. But then he said, "You know, it's like your song wasn't just for you. It was for them too, even her." She looked at him, surprised at the depth in his words. "Maybe," she said softly, "maybe that's why it mattered." At home, her grandmother was sitting in her usual chair, knitting in her lap. She looked up and said, "I saw the news." "The news?" the young woman asked, setting her guitar case down. Her grandmother nodded toward the small television. On the local channel, there was a short segment about the charity talent show. It showed clips of different acts, but when her performance appeared, the voiceover said, "A simple song with extraordinary heart, proving that talent knows no boundaries." Her brother almost jumped off the couch. "You're on TV," the young woman laughed, shaking her head. Just for a moment. But inside, she felt something warm take root. Over the next few days, invitations began to come, small ones at first. A community center wanted her to perform at a weekend event. A local cafe asked if she'd play a short set one evening. Nothing huge, but each one felt like a door she hadn't known existed slowly opening. One afternoon, after her shift, she sat in the empty auditorium at the school. The stage lights were off, the seats empty, but the silence here felt familiar. It's like the night she had stood in front of a crowd and sung her truth. She ran her fingers along the edge of the stage and thought about how this all began with a laugh in this very room. That sound had once made her want to disappear. But now, she realized it had only pushed her toward a moment that would define her in the eyes of others and in her own. At the next school event, she attended not as a worker, but as a guest. The rich girl spotted her in the crowd and gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that the balance between them had shifted forever. Later, as the young woman was leaving, she heard a voice call after her. "We all have a song, right?" She turned. The rich girl was standing there, a faint smile on her face. "Yes," the young woman said. "And sometimes it's the only thing that matters." They didn't need to say more. That night, back in her small apartment, she sat by the window. With her guitar, the city lights blinking faintly in the distance. She began to play not the same song from the show, but a new one. It spoke of rain-soaked mornings, of walls that once felt unbreakable, and of voices that could carry far beyond them. Her brother leaned against the doorframe, listening quietly. When she finished, he said, "That's even better than the last." "One," she smiled, not because she believed it yet, but because she knew he did. And that belief, his, her grandmother's, maybe even the rich girl's, was enough to keep her playing. The laugh that had started it all was now only a memory. Softened by time, it had been loud then, meant to belittle. But her song, steady, true, and unforgettable, had been the final word, and it was a word that would keep echoing long after the last note had faded. The echo after weeks passed, but the night of the talent show did not fade into the background of her life. It was as if that single evening had planted something new inside her, a small seed that kept growing quietly. Even while she went about her usual routines, every now and then, she would be in the middle of wiping a counter or carrying groceries when someone would stop her. A neighbor at the market would say, "I saw your video." A teacher at her brother's school would smile and tell her they had been humming her song all week. Even strangers would approach, their words shy but sincere. "Your voice, it stayed with me." It was still strange to her, this attention. She had spent so many years keeping her head down, blending into the edges of rooms. Now, people noticed her not because of what she did for a living, but because of something she had shared from her heart. The small invitations kept coming. Community fair asked her to perform in the open-air square, the stage set up under strings of lights. She sang with the cool night breeze brushing her face, her voice carrying over the sound of children laughing and people chatting. A cafe downtown offered her a regular slot on Friday evenings. She would sit by the window with her guitar, playing. For anyone who wanted to listen, office workers winding down after the week, couples on quiet dates, students studying with mugs of coffee. Sometimes the room was full, sometimes only a handful of people stayed until the end. but it didn't matter. Each song was another chance to let her voice breathe. Her brother became her biggest promoter, proudly telling anyone who would listen, "That's my sister." She sang in a school hall and made the whole place silent. At home, life still had its challenges. Bills didn't vanish, and work didn't suddenly become easy. She still woke early to take the bus to the house behind. The gates still scrubbed floors and polished silver. But even there, something had shifted. The rich girl no longer passed her with dismissive glances. Instead, there were small nods, and once a quiet good morning. It wasn't friendship, but it was respect, and that alone felt like a wall had been lowered. One afternoon, as the young woman was leaving work, the rich girl stopped her. "There's a studio in town," she said, almost hesitant. "They're looking for singers for a charity album. I told them about you. If you want, I can give them your number." The young woman didn't answer right away. She had learned not to rush decisions. But as she walked home, the thought lingered. Maybe this was another door waiting to be opened. Months later, she found herself back in the school auditorium this time, not as a visitor or a performer in a long list, but as the evening's main guest. The school had organized a benefit concert, and they wanted her to close the night. She stepped onto the stage. The lights warm against her skin, the crowd filled with faces she recognized: her grandmother, her brother, the music teacher who had first encouraged her, students who had been in the audience that night when it all began. She chose to sing the same song she had performed at the talent show, not because she didn't have new ones, but because this song had been the turning point. As her fingers found the chords, she felt the same calm determination she had felt months ago, the knowledge that this was more than music. It was her story. When she reached the final note, the applause rose again. But it was the quiet right before it, that deep, breath-held silence that filled her heart. Later that night, walking home with her brother under the glow of the street lamps, he said, "You know what I think? I think that laugh in the hall, it was supposed to happen. Because without it, maybe you wouldn't have sung that night." She thought about it. The memory of the rich girl's smirk no longer sharp, just a faded outline in her mind. "Maybe you're right," she said softly. "Sometimes the things meant to push you down end up lifting you instead." They reached their building, the smell of her grandmother's cooking drifting from the open window. As they climbed the stairs, the young woman glanced back once at the street below. She didn't know exactly where her music would take her next, but she knew one thing for certain: her voice no longer belonged only to her. It belonged to every person who had heard it and felt, even for a moment, that they were not alone. The next morning, she picked up her guitar before work, just to play a few notes. The sound filled the small apartment, warm and steady. Her grandmother looked up from her chair and said, "You should keep going. Songs like yours, they leave echoes." And the young woman smiled, because she knew now that those echoes could travel far past the walls of an auditorium, past the gates of a mansion, past the limits she once thought defined her. The laugh that had once felt like a wound had long since faded. Now the final word had been hers, not shouted, not forced, but sung, and the echo of that word was still moving, quietly but surely, into places she had never even dreamed of reaching.